Good morning. Welcome to Birding at Home, episode 6, Noises in the Night, with me, Dr. Beth Mott. Hello. Nice to have you all listening to this episode of BirdLife's Birding at Home talk. And today I wanted to talk about some of the noises in the night that you might experience at your house. There are a whole heap of birds that actually are really noisy at night time, and I guess one of the fantastic opportunities that comes to us in this environment where often many of us are staying a lot more at home than we used to is that there's the chance to hear and pay attention to these fantastic noises. There's a huge cacophony of animals that make noises at night, and for the bird fauna there are a suite of birds that make noises just at dusk and dawn. There are a suite of birds that are noisy through the day, and then there are really specialist birds that make all of these fantastic nighttime noises, and it's that group of birds that I wanted to introduce you to today. Firstly, I just wanted to note a few of the really cool birds that you might hear, particularly if you're up in the tropics. There are things like koalas, which migrate down from New Guinea and come all the way down south to Victoria in that area. But if you're in North Queensland, I think one of the most fantastic bird noises that you might hear is that of the voice of the bushstone curlew. We're working in COVID times and tech's not working quite as well as I'd want it to, so I'm playing the calls for you off my phone. So let me just find the curlew call and play it for you and listen to this beautiful song of one of the quintessential tropical birds that call at night time. A fantastic noise from the eastern curlew. And some of the other birds that you might hear are things like cows, which make a whoop, whoop, whoop repetitive call, and also shining bronze cuckoos. So whilst these are a suite of birds that we often hear, particularly before dawn in the morning, one of the ones that I want to go on and talk to you a bit more about are those truly nocturnal birds, the owls and the nightjars. And I guess whilst I want to run through quickly a little bit about who they are and how they sound, what I'd really like to talk about at the end of this talk is the threat that rodenticide is posing to many of these night birds, because many of the species that I'll talk about today are threatened species, and many of those species actually eat rats and mice, so they're at risk of being poisoned by rodenticides. So let me just quickly start and run through a few of the groups so you can listen to how fantastic they sound, and then we'll move on to the rodenticide part of the talk afterwards. So I guess there are a couple of things that will define birds as night birds. I think one of the most lovely things, of course, is that we can identify what a night bird looks like if we find a shed feather on the ground. So I wanted to just talk about a few really important features that make night birds different from day birds. So if you were to find a feather, and you can see the feather in the top of the image on your screen there, you can see this row of combs that run along the top edge of the feather, and then these fringy parts that are along the bottom edge of the feather. So those are two characters of a feather that let us know that what we're looking at is a feather from a nocturnal bird. Of course, many nocturnal birds have to fly extremely silently so that they can catch their prey at night without it getting away from them. And there has to be these adaptations in the feathers that allow silent flight, because generally bird flight is quite noisy. Any movement of air across a surface is quite noisy, and you get the passing of the air for a bird over the wing. There's vortex of air which helps the wing lift up as the birds fly, but that makes a big whooshing sound. So these little fringes and combs that you see on the feathers are the adaptations that nocturnal birds have that break up that air stream as it moves across the bird's wing. And instead of one big vortex of air, you get these little pockets, little curls of air vortices, and that allows the flight to be completely silent. Often when we find a feather that's what we call unzipped in the world of feathers, so the bottom part of the feather is quite fluffy. So you'll see on the left there's a powerful owl feather with this fluffy bottom, and on the right image at the bottom of the screen there's a tawny feather. That's another feature that baffles sound in nocturnal birds. So if you're finding feathers that have any of those three features, you know you're looking at a feather from a nocturnal bird. Of course, nocturnal birds have these big eyes for catching the starlight so that they can hunt, and they often have a really acute sense of hearing as well. So I just wanted to run through a few of the, particularly first to start with the owls. So we have 12 species of owl in Australia, and of those 3 species go down to Tassie, and some of them occur on the mainland, particularly in the south of Australia, and there are a few species that are only in the tropical areas. Many of these large owls belong in the group that we call large forest owls, and they're actually threatened species, and I've put the listing for their vulnerability at the top. So the first guy that we're going to talk about is the masked owl. He falls into the 2 groups of owls that we have in Australia. The group of owls are called the masked owls, and you'll see that they have this lovely disc shape around the outside of their face of feathers, which is why they're deemed masked owls. So at the top of that bit of information, you'll see on the screen, you can see how tall they stand and the wing distance when the wings are spread out. So for masked owls, they stretch their wings about 1.25 metres, which is a pretty big bird. Masked owls tend to like the drier country or often woodland areas rather than the rainforesty areas, and they exist in a band across the coast of Australia, from WA to Victoria, but also in Tassie. They're a very uncommon bird wherever they occur, and a really shy one, not one that we see very often because they roost down inside the tree hollows and they don't emerge until full dark. And one of the interesting things about masked owls is that the decline of this species is associated with our loss of small mammals in Australia. So as the small mammals are going, you're finding that masked owls are going too. So let me just quickly find a call for you, and I will play you a fantastic masked owl noise. Well, I would play you a fantastic masked owl noise, but foolishly, I seem to have deleted it off my phone. So I'll play you instead the next slide, which will be a grass owl. So grass owls are a tropical species of owl. They also are within that masked owl group of owls. They are almost as big as the masked owl that we saw previously, but they differ in having being one of the only owls that actually nest down on the ground. So they build these fantastic little nests in the swamplands where they live, in the grasslands where they live, and raise their chicks on little mounds inside the patches of grass. They go from far north Queensland to northern New South Wales, and they're known as the daddy long-legged bird. So if you see a grass owl in flight, that long leg trailing behind them as they fly is one of the really characteristic features. Let me see if I can quickly find you the grass owl call. I think they make a really beautiful call, and unfortunately when you call, because of the area in which they live, when you're recording a grass owl call, often you'll get those frog noises in the background too, which is just another element of that lovely nighttime noise that we often hear. One of the other owls that I'd like to talk about is the barn owl. So of all the owls that we'll talk about today, this is the only species that actually goes into other parts of the world apart from Australia. And these are a smaller owl. Their wingspan's about 1 metre. They like open grasslands, and opposed to some of the other owls that we're going to talk about, this isn't a species. This is a species that does quite well in urban spaces. So they like to use farm sheds, hay barns. They often like to use farmlands, and you can often find them in the urban space as well, around wetlands particularly. These guys seem to pop up when we have things like mouse plagues, and they can actually respond in terms of their breeding to the availability of prey in the environment. Unlike many of the other owls, they might not have a set breeding season. If there's the food around, they can get up and breed, which is really nice. And one of the really cool things, of course, about barn owls is that whilst they like to use tree hollows, as many of our owls do, they also nest in caves. Just quickly pull up the barn owl call for you. So that harsh ratcheting squeak is actually really typical of the voice that many of this masked owl group of owls have, as opposed to the more melodic sounds of the hawk owls that I'll talk about next. The Sooty owl is one of them, fantastic and beautiful, one of the smallest group of our large forest owls that are threatened. They have a wingspan of about a metre again, and these guys are really a rainforest specialist owl. They, unlike many of the other owls, apart from the barn owl, they like to nest in caves, and particularly in rock ledges as well, down in really wooded gullies. They're a really shy owl. They're not one that we would ever expect to see much of, but if we look at the records that come through our wildlife carer groups, we're finding that sooty owls are actually moving through the suburbs where we live. It's just that they're such a shy species that it's rare that we see them, particularly if we live along the east coast of Australia. They're also one of the owls that have a really distinctive voice, and they tend to be one of, when people write to me and say, I'm hearing a weird noise at night and it's scaring my kids, it tends to be something like a sooty owl that's calling, because they have this incredible voice. And one of the other names for this species is the wailing woman bird. So let me play it for you. So that harsh screech is really typical of, as I said, many of our masked owls, but the sooty owl is perhaps the one that has one of the scariest voices at night time. Let's move on to the rufous owl, which is one of our tropical owls. He's quite a big one with a wingspan of 1.15 metres. And these guys live in rainforests and woodlands in far north Queensland and NT and hang around up the top of Australia. I think one of the really cool things about this species of owl is that, like our powerful owl that we'll talk about in a minute, these rufous owls are a species that are managing to adapt to what's going on in the urban space. So because urban trees are becoming, hollow-bearing trees are becoming so uncommon, both in woodland areas and in the urban space, owls are having to find other things to breed in. And the picture that you're seeing in front of you is actually a rufous owl nesting in an African mahogany, about 3 metres from the ground, which is really unusual for owls. But in Darwin, they're actually moving into these areas far more readily than we would have expected that they would have. Many owls won't have the flexibility to change the things that they like to breed in, and so retaining tree hollows becomes really, really important for many species. The barking owl is the first of the group that I'd like to talk about in our group of owls that are the hawk owls. So these owls don't have that facial disc of feathers, and the barking owl is a really bombastic owl. It's quite big with a wingspan of 1.2 metres, and whilst they go all over Australia, the distribution of these guys is quite sparse. So everywhere they occur, they only occur in relatively low numbers. And they're one of the species of owl that we're really trying to collect more data on. We know that they have a real stronghold in the Pilliga area of Australia. They're a woodland species, but as opposed to many other owls, the sort of area that they need to support themselves is really large, so up to as much as 6,000 to 8,000 hectares for a single pair of owls. I have a pair of these woofing away at the moment up in the central coast of New South Wales, so let me give you a listen to what they sound like. So that was a pair of barking owls duetting, so you could hear two sets of woofing. And in fact, people write in all of the time saying, I've got this weird dog barking in my backyard, and often it's barking owls rather than dogs. One of the owls that's really familiar to many of us is the Boobook owl. This is one of our smallest owls. It's a forest species. They like to hang around on the east coast of Australia where all that great forest is developed, but they go throughout the rest of Australia as well. They love a bit of fantastic cover, vine thickets, wooded gullies, all of that sort of stuff. But they're probably one of the most common owl species that we'll hear. So let me play it for you, because often when I play this call, people know that that's a noise that they do hear at night time. That's a typical Boobook sound, woofing away. I have them here in the creek line near my place, and sometimes I can hear 4 birds all calling within the space of about 100 metres. It's really fantastic to have them with us. And of course, I have to talk, being the Powerful Owl Project Officer, about Powerful Owl. And Powerful Owl are our biggest owl in Australia. and I guess in some ways a really confident, what we call a super predator, so an predatory species that actually eats other predators. They go all of the way from Mackay along the east coast of Australia down to the border of Victoria, and unlike many of the other species that are in trouble, powerful owl have actually done really well at starting to use the urban space, and we know that they're moving into the urban space using those green fingers of bushland that push up our creekways into the suburbs. They are restricted to using tree hollows, and we know that the hollows powerful owls need take upwards of about 150 years to develop. They're one of the species that you will be hearing. Well, most of the other species that I've talked about, you might hear as the weather becomes hot and as we move through the year towards Christmas and then into autumn. But powerful owl are one of the species that you'll be hearing at the moment at your place. They're a winter breeder, and the breeding season started around April time. So we have this really bombastic spate of calling, and then it goes quiet while they start to nest, which is what's happening at the moment, and then they'll start calling again as the chicks come up out of the hollows. So let me play you the call, because this is the sort of information that we would love to be able to record. If we know where these owls are, we can do a great job in actually protecting them by advising our land managers and working really closely with them to make sure we do the right things in the environment to keep these owls here. I wanted you to hear that, because that's a really typical hoo-hoo sort of sound that we would think about when we think about owls, which is the sort of noise that many of our owls in Europe make as well. But if you're hearing hoo-hoo in Australia, it's most of the time it's going to be a powerful owl. Most of the other species don't have that voice. But what's really interesting about powerful owl is that the chicks sound very different to the adults. And we won't be hearing them yet because it's a bit early, but in the next potentially 8 weeks or so, maybe a bit longer, we should start to hear chicks trilling in the environment if we're lucky enough to have breeding near us. Let me play you what the chicks sound like. So that's a really distinctive sound, and the chicks are very loud and often very curious, so people might find them flying into their own veranda areas and they hear this weird, loud, crazy trilling noise, and often that's an owl chick just getting up into the world. I guess one of the really interesting and important things to say about these guys is if we don't report that we're hearing these sorts of birds, it's like they don't exist. In terms of the land manager's perspective, it's like they don't exist. So joining bird data and recording the birds that you see, writing into BirdLife and sending an email saying I'm hearing this fantastic noise at night is incredibly important in allowing us to do better to protect our fauna. Okay, moving on to the frogmouths. This guy, the tawny frogmouth, is one of the most common of our and widespread of our frogmouth species in Australia. They're one of the biggest species as well, with wings to 90 centimetres. We have 3 species of frogmouths, the marbled and puffwing frogmouths as well, which are up in Queensland. And I guess for the tawny frogmouth particularly, this is one of the birds that is doing quite well in the urban space. These guys love to eat things like moths, although they do actually eat mice as well. But moths and beetles are the primary part of their diet, and we do a great job in building more moths and beetles when we have urban lighting. So often that's why we find these guys coming into the urban space. These are communal nesters, so unlike any of the other birds that we've talked about today, we have chicks hanging around from the previous breed to help the parents with the next succession of babies. So often when you see tawny frogmouths, you might see not just the 3 or 4 chicks and parents, but you might actually see 2 juveniles from the year before. Sometimes I've seen as much as 8 tawny frogmouths all hanging out together, helping each other. So they're a lovely family bird. I just wanted to play you their call because they have a really good voice. Let me play it for you. So if you're hearing that noise at night, you're lucky that you've got tawny frogmouths in your area. And people think that tawny frogmouths are this gentle, passive bird that hangs around in the urban space, but I'm here to tell you that they're not necessarily that passive. So I raise tawny frogmouths every year when we can't manage to give them back to their parents. And whilst they often say hello, hello, hello while they're in care, there's a lot of time where they actually also say Avada Kedavra. And for those of you that don't know, that's a Harry Potter death curse. So they will actually throw that at you fairly often too. The other nightjars that we see in Australia are the spotted, white-throated and large-tailed nightjars. They're very cryptic, these species, and unlike any of the other species that we've talked about, nest down on the ground. So they don't actually build a nest, but they will lay their eggs in a little scrape in the leaf litter on the ground, and they're incredibly camouflaged because of that. So whilst the female's sitting, and when she goes out to forage, the eggs themselves are highly camouflaged as well. Unlike the rest of the owls that we've talked about today and the nightjars that we've talked about, these guys are insectivores only, so they're not one of the ones that are going to be affected by rodenticides, but they often are affected by other sorts of pesticides that we use in the environment, particularly things like termiticides, which tend to get into the food chain and affect insect fauna, which is, of course, what these birds eat. Here's one of our other nightjars that you may see around your place. This is the Australian owlet nightjar, and this guy is the teddy bear in the bird world. It's perhaps one of the cutest of all of the birds, I think. They've got these lovely big round eyes. This one's got his eyes closed. He's actually having a bask in the sun, which is quite typical, and often people will see nightjars when they're having a bit of a sunbake. Just see if I can quickly pull up a call of a nightjar for you, an owlet nightjar. So if you live in an area where you have woodland or hollow trees near your place and you're hearing that noise, that's the guy that you're actually hearing. Tree hollows are a huge part of what's important for all of those birds that we just mentioned. And I wanted to show you this great picture, Beth, because I think it really shows what's going on for all of these hollow nesters in Australia at the moment, and has been going on for a while. We're losing tree hollows at a massive rate in Australia. Here's a picture of a little owlet nightjar being menaced by an orange-bellied parrot. And this is quite typical of what's happening. There's huge competition for the hollows, and parrots, which tend to be a bit more numerous than many of our night birds, often go in and will kill the chicks so they can use the hollows for themselves. This is happening for all of the species, and one remedy for this, of course, is making sure that we retain all hollow-bearing trees where we can, even if the hollows are quite small. So if we're talking about a hollow of about that size, that's about 80 years to develop and will fit something like a sugar glider. If we're talking about a hollow that a powerful owl needs, something like 30 or 40 centimetres, that's, as I said, at least 150 years to develop. Hollows are a huge part of this story for nocturnal birds. But of course, one of the other threats that these birds are facing, I think, is, there are a myriad of things that affect nocturnal birds that we don't see in the same sort of threat development for our birds that are active in the day. There are things like urban lighting and the prevalence of glass in the urban space, which are becoming much greater in terms of their impact on birds. But there are also things like electrocution, particularly car strike. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about most today is the prevalence of the use of rodenticides in Australia. And I wanted to talk about this because we have an opportunity at the moment to make public comment on how these products are used. I wanted to introduce you to the rodenticides, what people do in other countries in terms of controlling them, what we do here in Australia, and how they affect animals, so that you get a full understanding of the story and hopefully would like to make comment about that yourself. So rodenticides are, of course, designed to kill rats and mice. They also, as we know, target heaps of non-target species that aren't rats and mice, which include wildlife. And this happens through either a secondary or primary poisoning. So in primary poisoning, the animal will eat the rodenticide or the pesticide directly. In secondary poisoning, you have an animal that eats another animal that has that pesticide or rodenticide in its body. So the effects of primary and secondary poisoning on wildlife really depend on the species that's being affected and on the type, and particularly the amount of poison that's been eaten. So this little antechinus that's in the picture on your screen there has the opportunity to be poisoned directly by primary poisoning, probably not through rodenticide, although they do actually eat mice sometimes. But they also have the opportunity to become a secondary poisoning vector, particularly for some of those night birds that we just had talked about. So if we see an owl coming down to eat something like an antechinus, but the antechinus has eaten a mouse itself or has eaten insects that are poisoned by pesticide, that owl will be poisoned by eating the antechinus. I wanted to talk a little bit about how these rodenticides work, because there are two different classes of rodenticide, and they actually act quite differently. Most rodenticides work by disrupting blood clotting, so they prevent the formation of vitamin K. And then an animal will bleed to death either through internal bleeding if something's going on there, or through external bleeding, like cutting itself as it goes around. There are actually two generations of rodenticides that exist. The first generation rodenticides, or FGARs, were developed in the 1970s, and those sorts of poisons tend to need multiple doses of the rats and mice to eat them to work. There are a whole different variety of names and compounds for those sorts of things. I've put the compounds in there, but often the brand name of the rodenticides that's available on the shelf is different to the name of the compound that causes the poisoning. So these first generation rodenticides stopped being as effective for rats and mice, and so a second generation of rodenticides called SGARs were developed. These tend to be only single dose, so the animal will eat them only one time, but the thing is that they take sometimes quite a long time to actually cause death in the animal, which might mean that an animal will come back and eat of that poison several times, so the dosage of the poison inside its body becomes much higher. So the other thing, and of course because of this, these sorts of poisons tend to bioaccumulate, so they move up the food chain really easily. The other thing about second generation rodenticides is that they tend to be stored in fat really easily. So when animals have a lean time, if they're exposed to rodenticide poisoning, when we move into a lean time and they start to metabolize fat in their body, they'll actually reintroduce poison into their body and become poisonous to other animals that want to eat them, or die of the poison themselves. So they're very slow to clear from the body. They tend to be really problematic for wildlife, more so than the first gen poisons. But I would say that both first and second generation poisons all change behaviour of animals to make them more susceptible to predation. So if a mouse or rat eats this poison, it tends to change its response to being scared by something. Rather than running away, it might hunker down and stay still, which it makes them more prone to actually being eaten by raptors, and that causes one of the problems for wildlife. Rodenticides are actually a really important part of how we go about our lives. They protect the food that we eat, they protect the health of our animals, they protect our houses. So they're not something that we should just consider are bad and that we should never use them, because if we were to stop using them altogether, that might be quite a serious, might have serious flow-on effects for the health of ourselves. They're also really important in preventing damage to installations, particularly when you have rats and mice chewing, which leads often to fire. And they protect people's structures and possessions. And they have a really, really important role to play in the removal of particularly rats and mice from islands. When we're trying to rehabilitate the native fauna of islands, they're one of the key tools in that process of conservation for island fauna. These sorts of anticoagulant rodenticides are used globally. They're the most frequently used sort of rodenticide all over the world. And they're being really heavily legislated in the European Union, in Canada and the US, because of their persistency, because of their potential for secondary transfer, and because there's a real human cost to the use of these rodenticides as well, where we know that there was a whole spate of poisoning of children, particularly associated with the use of rodenticides. We know that in the US, the EPA has found exposure, a widespread exposure in non-target populations. So they did some studies in New York and found that nearly half of all of their species of raptors and owls were exposed to lethal levels of rodenticide poisoning. And when they looked at larger animals in the food chain like bobcats and foxes, they found about 84% of all the animals they sampled were exposed to rodenticide poisoning to lethal levels. And that data is representative of the whole situation of rodenticide use in the US. So they've extrapolated that data across the whole of the state, the whole of the country. In Australia, we have a really different situation for the use of rodenticides. It's only really loosely regulated, while some poisons do have restrictions about how they're supposed to be used. Often the sale of those poisons is really widespread, so people can buy them and use them however they want to. We use them in our houses and our gardens. We use them in our food production places and our facilities. So we use them all over Australia. We don't have a great deal of research in Australia about the effects of these rodenticides on non-target species, particularly wildlife, and some of the new research that's only come out in the last year or so has found that at least 37 species that we've tested so far have been exposed to lethal levels of rodenticide poisoning. When we look at that data for Boobook owls specifically, there's some really interesting trends that say that the higher the urban density, the greater the amount of poisoning that owls are exposed to, particularly that over 70% of the owls that were sampled in that study were exposed to lethal or more than lethal levels of rodenticide poisoning, and that that poison is being fed to the chicks before they actually fledge the nest. That doesn't bear well for this little Boobook chick that you can see on the other side of the screen, because that's an urban Boobook owlet, and the likelihood of him being exposed to this level of rodenticide is actually really high based on that research that we've had so far. Outside of the formalised research, there's masses of anecdotal information from wildlife rescue groups that identify rodenticide poisoning in a swathe of animals, which include things like possums, small mammals, wombats, lizards and raptors. So it's really widespread in Australia, and I would say that there's actually a real human cost to rodenticides being so widely available as well, and that includes the fact that we see more than 1,400 contacts with the Poisons Information Centre for humans being poisoned by rodenticides each year in Australia. So there's a real important component that we need to consider that isn't just about wildlife when we think about how these poisons should be used. At the moment, the Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicine Authority is the body that governs how these poisons are used, where they're used, what sort of form that they should be used in, and at the moment they're seeking consultation on patterns of rodenticide use, which include both first-generation and second-generation poisons. So they're asking a whole swathe of things that they'd like you to make comment on. These are the need for these products to be used at all, whether you use them in your home, inside your home, outside your home, in your gardens, whether they should be used in urban situations, whether they should be used in farms or primary production settings. I think one of the really important things that they're asking for comment on is how those poisons should be delivered, whether it's in a pelletized form, whether it's in a powder, whether it's in a paste, all of that sort of stuff, because that will affect how accessible these poisons are to our wildlife. And I think one of the most important things, of course, is how timely the collection of those dead or dying rodent bodies will be. It's a part of the legislation that those bodies should be collected, but the likelihood of that actually happening for most of the time is very small. So your opportunity to comment about all of this stuff is actually open now. There's a deadline for written submissions of the 3rd of July. You can have a look at that website to make your submission. You can write it or email it in. And if you'd like a submission template or some ideas or some more information about why this is so important and what we can do about it, please go to the Act for Birds rat poison campaign that BirdLife Australia has put together, and you'll find a whole heap of information that might help you decide what you would like to say about this stuff. BirdLife's position on all of this is that the legislation in Australia really needs to be brought in line with the sorts of legislation that we're seeing in other parts of the world. We would recommend that particularly the SCARs are regulated to be removed from general availability and that they're only available to licensed professionals, that without that licensing you can only use second-generation rodenticides indoors, that all rodenticides should be available in tamper-proof bait stations, which bears some thinking about for birds, and that these poisons should be available for conservation use under licence, and it's really important that that's a part of the use of these products that we continue to support, because that's our first line of defence for clearing rodents away, particularly from islands. I hear everyone freaking out saying, I've got a mouse in the kitchen and now I can no longer do anything to get rid of it. But I think you need to realise that there are other products available that you can use safely in your home. One of these products is a product called Ratsack Naturals. It's a plant-based product. It's a new one on the market, so any research about its effectiveness or its problems for non-target species aren't really documented, but based on its action, the likelihood of this providing secondary poisoning to wildlife is very small. So it's a corn product. It doesn't use any of those comatril-based poisons that the rest of the rodenticides all use, and it works by coating the gastrointestinal tract of the rodent so water can't pass in and out from the gastrointestinal tract into the body, which basically means that the rodent will dehydrate. It's advertised as having no secondary transfer. So when you're looking for a poison that you want to use a poison and you're looking for one that you think will be safe, you want to look for something that advertises itself as pet safe or wildlife safe. So those two things should have no secondary transfer, but do keep an eye on your product ingredients in the product to make sure that they don't include some of those really bad poisons. And of course, there are lots of things that we can do to actually really effectively pest-proof our environments without using things that are dangerous. First thing would be to make sure that we really tidy up our gardens. We pick up any garden waste, fallen fruit, and particularly put away pet food so that we're not creating a rodent draw. We rodent-proof our chook pens and aviaries and our houses, of course. And I would say that if you're hearing rats inside a dwelling, it's very rarely going to be a bush rat, or a native species of rat. Usually inside dwellings, it's generally only non-native species that will come in and use those spaces. We would like to replace rat-friendly palms with our friendly native vegetation, of course, and to encourage native predators, we want to plant native trees and conserve our tree hollows, or, if possible, use targeted nest boxes for species to breed in. We want to be able to reduce our dependence on poisons, particularly to consider non-poison pest control, and there are fantastic opportunities to use some snap traps that are very effective at killing rodents at the moment. And, of course, read the labels on any products that you buy and make the changes to those products that have no secondary transfer. And, of course, leave any products that do have involve second-generation rodenticides on the shelf. They're not the ones that we want to use to protect our wildlife. I hope I've given you a bit of a rundown of the situation in Australia. I've heard some fantastic nightbird noises and given you a great opportunity to make a difference in your part of the world in terms of making comment about how you think rodenticide poisons should be used. Thank you very much, and I will see you next time.